Welcome to the third devlog of this yet-to-be-titled RPG. Today we are talking about the battle system. For that, I firstly created a few placeholder assets. 1 background, 3 player characters and 3 enemies. Should be enough for the first round of testing. I also created a few other art assets. An arrow to indicate which enemy to attack, a shield to indicate blocking, and a simple particle effect to show that someone got hit. Nothing fancy, but enough to make it clear what is happening in a battle. Next was creating the battlers. Some people call them units, but I'm used to the word battler from my time with RPG Maker VX Ace. I'm talking about the characters in the battle scene. In my game at the moment they are mostly just a sprite together with some variables that keep track of the progression in the battle, like whether they are currently active. More importantly, they have a custom resource attached to it which holds the battler's stats. Experience points, health, attack, defense, speed, stuff like that. I'm calling it a character sheet. This system was inspired by a video by Queble, linked below, but I ended up doing things quite differently in the end. An important part here are the progression curves, formulas that describe the progression of the various stats when the character levels up. In the end, I will do the balancing in a spreadsheet and most likely have the results as lookup tables in a CSV file. For now, however, I think I'm mostly comfortable with them being explicit math formulas I can fiddle with in-game. So I'm using the expression class to turn the strings I put into the export variables into actual functions I can use. Probably not the most elegant solution, but it works for me. What tripped me up was that I put this code that reads the export variable into the init function. I thought that it runs once the resource is loaded, but somehow it didn't work as expected, and I had to put it into a separate setup function, which I call manually when loading the resource. Apparently I'm misunderstanding something about how resources are loaded, but it's fine. In any case, I created character sheets for my 3 playable characters and 3 enemies. Not too many thoughts went into the stats yet. With these in place, most of the battle system was fairly simple and straightforward. Keeping track of the overall state, which battler is active, adding buttons that allow you to select a target to attack, etc. A bit fiddly and I made many mistakes, but nothing really unexpected. For the enemies, I started an AI resource that is attached to the respective battlers, but that's just a placeholder for now. It only has one function that picks an opponent at random and attacks it. For the actual damage calculation, I googled what common formulas are and just took one. Concretely, I calculate the damage as twice the attack stat of the attacker minus the defense stat of the target. But only if the attack is larger than the defense value. If it is smaller, I take the square of the attack divided by the defense. That eliminates the possibility of dealing 0 damage. Not important right now, of course, but with most things in this devlog series, I want to put things into place that can potentially stay there for a while. Something that might be of interest here, as a way to future-proof the interface for the various attacks I might have, I created a custom resource called Battle Effect. It stores the affected battler together with all relevant numerical information. How much damage to deal, how much to buff or debuff someone, etc. The AI resource then returns an array of these battle effects. That way I can create all actions as their own resource. And it makes it easier to do several things at the same time, like dealing damage to an enemy while healing yourself. One thing in the battle script that caused me many headaches, calculating the turn order for the different battlers and displaying it on screen. If I only wanted to take all the battlers on screen, enemies and party members together and sort them by their speed value, well, that's just a single command using Godot's sort custom function. But that would mean that I always think in rounds, where every battler moves once. Something you would see in Octopus Traveler, for example. However, I want to have a continuous stream of turns. Not only visually, that would be easy, but functionally. Concretely, if a battler gets a speed buff, I want him to be able to catch up with battlers in front of them, and not just be faster within each round. To achieve this, I store how often a battler already acted in a variable called turn total here in my code. When comparing battlers, I look at the ratio between the turn total and their speed stat. That way, battlers which acted more often get perceived as slower, but fast characters can still overcome this to act more frequently. Another interpretation of this, if we take the classic velocity formula, displacement over time, and solve for time, we get something similar looking. If we interpret the turn total as some sort of distance the battler has to travel, maybe literally how far back they start before they are allowed to act in the fight, we are calculating the wait time here. So it kinda makes sense to do it this way. Unfortunately, it didn't feel right. The fastest character acted too often. My current solution is to take the logarithm of the speed stat. I could make a whole video about how to interpret logarithms, but here I use it to smooth things out a bit. But it doesn't feel overwhelming anymore. I will come back to this once I start to balance the progress curves for all the stats. But for now, it's fine. The last thing to note about the speed stat, I don't actually use the speed stat itself, but a copy of it, to which I add a random number between -3 and 3. That way, there will be a bit of variance between battlers with very similar speed values. The final part of the turn order is displaying it on screen. Nothing difficult in and of itself. Whenever I add a new entry to my array that keeps track of the next dozen or so turns, I also add a texture rect to the top of the screen. A simple shader fades it out if it's too far right. What tripped me up for a while? Animating the blocks moving to a new position when a battler dies. It was a combination of using Q3 without waiting a frame and making an off by 1 error. These cancelled each other out in a weird way so that it was quite tricky to isolate the problem. But now it works. And with that we have a basic battle loop. Many typical features are still missing, obviously, like fleeing or using items or receiving experience points and loot, but we can do simple battle stuff. The question that now remains is, what is the battle system I want to use? When I was thinking about starting an RPG a few months ago, I was playing Slay the Spire a lot. My favorite character there is the Defect, a robot which uses orbs of various elements. Each orb is first channeled. While it is channeled, a weak version of a particular effect is triggered. For the lightning orb, for example, that means that an enemy is attacked with a weak attack. Then, a channeled orb can be evoked, which triggers a strong version of the effect, and then makes the orb vanish. For the lightning orb, that means a strong attack. Then a rhythm develops in the battles depending on which orbs you have access to. And I was thinking, hey, that could easily be adapted to a turn-based RPG, basically without any changes. So this is what I want to do as the main battle feature. Every character can do a regular attack and a block, as you would see in most RPGs. Additionally, every character in my game will be able to equip magic spells represented by orbs. For the foreseeable future, I will simply copy the vocabulary from Slay the Spire. Each turn, a random orb is channeled, which triggers a passive effect while it is in the channeled state. Here I'm mostly thinking about buffs and other things that affect the player characters. Each turn, a channeled orb can be evoked, which triggers an active effect. This will mostly be attacks and other things that affect the enemy. Then, the orb goes back to an inactive state. There will probably be a cooldown period, which says how long an orb must be inactive before it can be channeled again. But that will be a question for future me. A few examples I have in mind for combinations of passive and active spells that could be paired together. An orb that gives the player an attack buff while channeled and attacks the enemy with a fireball when evoked. An orb that heals a small amount of HP of the player character while channeled and a large amount of the HP of the rest of the party when evoked. Maybe there could be a variant that the party heal becomes weaker the longer the orb is channeled or something like that, to make it more of a strategic decision of when to evoke. Another option might be an orb that makes you absorb/block a certain amount of damage while channeled and then dealing the absorbed damage back to the enemy when evoked, but you couldn't do anything else while it is channeled. Or something very simple like an orb that gives you a speed buff when channeled and applies a speed debuff to the enemy when evoked. I already started a list of effects and it will be a big design and balancing effort to get them right, especially in combination with how orbs are obtained. Maybe some simple/weak orbs can be bought in a store and strong ones can only be found in the world or via side quests. There are other open questions, for example whether orbs will have elements attached to them and what the interaction between elements is. So many things to consider in the future. Nothing I will bother with for a while. Now, if you know your video game history, you might realize that this orb system I came up with is by and large identical to the Chin system from Golden Sun. Which is a funny coincidence, since Golden Sun is one of my favorite games, but since I came from Slay the Spire with the idea, I haven't realized that until after I wrote it down. In any case, that's a good thing, I would say, as it tells me that the system in and of itself can work. I just have to balance it properly. Heavy emphasis on just. Another thing I want to do in my battle system, since I want the player to be able to assign any orb to any character, I want some way to give each character, well, character. Firstly, this will be done via stats. It's probably a me thing, but whenever I have too much freedom in assigning skill points to stats, I tend to homogenize my party. So I want each character to have their own fixed progression for each stat. One character might be tanky, with high HP and high defense. Another one might be fast but with low HP. But this is more a personal preference than a design-driven decision. Secondly, I want several types of weapons which can be equipped to characters based on their archetype, as you might see in Lufia 2 or Octopus Traveler. The soldier can equip swords and spears, the hunter spears and bows, the assassin bows and daggers, stuff like that. Probably not a full chop system though. Thirdly, I want characters to have special attacks aside from the magic spells given by orbs. And these special attacks then are tied to both the archetype and the weapon type. For example, a soldier might have a special sword attack that deals high damage to a single enemy, and a warrior has a special sword attack that deals medium damage to multiple enemies. So far so standard. Where it gets interesting, I hope. To use a special attack, a character has to use stamina points. Stamina gets quickly replenished outside of battle, so there's an incentive to use it a lot. The really special point though, if you don't have enough stamina left for a particular attack, you can do it anyway, but your character will lose HP instead. I have no idea whether that will be entertaining, that's for playtesting to find out, but I like the idea. I also want to hook up the stamina system to the orb system. By default, only one orb, probably at random, gets channeled each turn. If you want to channel more, you can use stamina to do so. Again, we will see during playtesting whether this has any merit, but I will definitely implement it. And this is where we will end this devlog. I will start working on my list of orbs and maybe start implementing them together with the special attacks. For the next devlog, however, I might focus on a few other loose threads, but we will see. With that, thank you for watching and until next time.